This is the North Country Journal Hour, the radio show that gives you insight into the daily life in Korea and Korea's rich history and culture, and also highlights the U.S. Army's history here in Korea, along with other topics of interest to Area 1 soldiers, airmen, civilians, and family members. I'm Army Sergeant Anthony Alcantar, and on each edition of the North Country Journal Hour, we hear from Mr. Frank Fisher, creator of the North Country Journal Hour radio commentaries and the editor of the North Country Journal Hour. The hour brings you a deeper look into the topics you hear in those 2-minute commentaries that air here on AFN Casey the Eagle. Now here's the 2-minute commentary that today's broadcast will expand on, the history of the Korean War Medal of Honor recipient, Corporal Daniel Schoonover.
This is the North Country Journal with Frank Fisher.
If I were to tell you about someone named Corporal Daniel Schoonover and how he earned the Medal of Honor in the Korean War, you'd understand why the Schoonover Bowl Sports Stadium on Camp Casey is named in his memory. Corporal Schoonover was killed in action in 1953 during the Second Battle of Porkchop Hill. He was 19 and in charge of a demolition squad working with the infantry. Orders came to drive Chinese forces off of high ground on Porkchop Hill. But the Chinese laid on a devastating artillery barrage, and the Americans were taking very heavy losses. The teenaged corporal decided the only way to get at the enemy was to lead his squad up the steep, barren slopes and go straight at the Chinese positions. Once there, an artillery round exploded on the roof of an enemy bunker. Schoonover dashed for the bunker and leaped in. He killed one enemy soldier and took another one prisoner. Later, another bunker was causing big trouble, so Schoonover ran right up to it through a hail of hostile fire. He hurled grenades through an opening, then rushed to the doorway where he emptied his pistol and killed whoever was left alive. The fighting raged for 2 days. When his company was pulled out, he volunteered to stay and kept up the fight. He was last seen pouring automatic fire into the enemy until artillery fire killed him. Corporal Daniel Schoonover, an American soldier whose valor on this, the Korean peninsula, is honored at Schoonover Bowl, right here in our own Area 1.
And that was the North Country Journal from Frank Fisher, the writer-editor with the USAG Red Cloud and Area 1 Public Affairs Office.
Now for a lot more on our subject, here's Mr. Fisher.
Thanks, Sergeant Alcantar. We've chosen this particular day to remember Corporal Daniel Schoonover because today marks the 82nd anniversary of his birth. Were he alive, he'd turn 82 today. He was born in Idaho and enlisted in the Army when he was 18. He became a combat engineer with the 7th Infantry Division. We know something of what he was like, partly from the book On Hallowed Ground, The Second Battle of Porkchop Hill by Bill McWilliams. McWilliams writes that Schoonover was, quote, blonde, handsome, athletic-looking, smart, ambitious, and full of energy and scrap, lively, brash, hard-working, unquote. I think that anyone in our listening audience, especially if they're young soldiers, airmen, service members, will be impressed and even inspired when they hear more about him this morning. For one, Corporal Schoonover, as we've said, was 19. He was a teenager, technically still an adolescent. And yet, young though he was, he already had in his character and personality the qualities that make for a good leader. And as we'll be hearing, his superiors had already noticed that leadership ability in the young corporal and helped develop it. And for our listeners who are interested in leadership, and that's most of them, I think, it's also interesting that when Corporal Schoonover first arrived in Korea, he came to be considered something of a problem soldier, one that they weren't all that glad to have in the unit. In fact, his company commander asked to have Schoonover transferred to another company, Able Company, and the CO of Able Company agreed to take Schoonover in. Well, we'll hear more about those things when we return after the break. Here's Sergeant Alcantar.
All right, and like you said, we'll be back with more from the North Country Journal Hour. But first, let's get back into the music with Wildest Dreams, Taylor Swift. We are back with the North Country Journal Hour, and here's Mr. Frank Fisher.
Thanks, Sergeant Alcantar. We're telling the story today of Corporal Daniel Schoonover. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for his valor during the Korean War. He enlisted in the Army because his older brother, Pat, was already in uniform. Pat Schoonover was in Korea with the 13th Engineer Combat Battalion, and Daniel Schoonover wanted to serve in the same unit with his older brother. As we heard before the break, Corporal Schoonover's company commander was less than thrilled with him, and he asked the CO of a different company if he'd take Corporal Schoonover in. That company was Able Company, and its commander was Captain James A. Bertel. That is, he was the commander of the other company. Well, Captain Bertel was known as an experienced leader who had the ability to take so-called problem soldiers and turn them into squared-away, good-to-go soldiers and leaders, too. And that's exactly what happened with Corporal Schoonover. Captain Bertel said yes, he'd take Schoonover into Able Company. Schoonover asked if he could serve in the same platoon with his brother Pat. Well, to that request, Captain Bertel said a flat no. He did not want brothers in the same platoon. If you've seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, you may remember what that was about. And the reason that Captain Bertel didn't want brothers in the same platoon was that if one were killed, it would be bad enough for their family. But if both were killed, it would be even worse. Once he was in Able Company, Corporal Schoonover went from being the problem soldier he'd been in his previous unit to a very different kind of soldier. For the soldiers of the 13th Engineer Battalion, the main job they had at that time was to give engineer support to the infantry units. And the place where he spent a lot of time doing that, Corporal Schoonover that is, was on a place called Pork Chop Hill. Famous battle site during the Korean War. There was a movie made of it called Pork Chop Hill, starring Gregory Peck. Well, the engineers there kept plenty busy. Pork Chop Hill, by the way, rose 300 meters high. It got its name because of its shape. It reminded people of a pork chop. And it's above the 38th parallel, which roughly marks the border between North and South Korea. Two fiercely contested battles were fought on Pork Chop Hill, both in 1953. The first in April, the second in July. The 7th Infantry Division had a company-sized infantry outpost on Pork Chop, and its defenses had just been torn up under a ferocious two-day battle in April. And once Schoonover was in Able Company, he was part of the engineer effort to rebuild and strengthen those battered defensive positions. His hard work and his dedication were noticed, and as we hear in a letter he wrote to his mother, that's how we know this, from a letter that he wrote to his mother, and this was just weeks, by the way, before he was killed. The letter is quoted in the McWilliams book. In one part of the letter, Corporal Schoonover told his mother, quote, "The people on top of the ladder around here must like my efforts, as I am a squad leader now. I was an assistant a week ago, but the squad leader went on R&R, rest and rehabilitation, so I took over while he was gone. We were working on Pork Chop then, and I worked the squad pretty hard so we could get off the hill sooner. Ended up getting more work done, even if we were putting in 16 hours a day, than anybody else. The company commander thought so much of it, he made me squad leader after the old one came back. Now, the old one is taking my orders. Pardon my boasting about my progress, but it makes me feel so good I had to tell you." Unquote. Later, in July, the Chinese launched a big attack on Pork Chop. They brought it under extremely heavy mortar and artillery pounding. Then they sent in the infantry in wave on wave against the American positions. During the fighting, the Americans mounted a counterattack against Chinese troops on one part of the hill. Corporal Schoonover volunteered to lead an engineer sapper squad. The plan was for them to use explosives to destroy Chinese-held bunkers once they got up to the top of the hill. Well, in the middle of the afternoon, the infantry and Schoonover's squad of combat engineers were set to go, but they found themselves under deadly enemy mortar and artillery fire. The casualties began to mount. Things got worse, and Corporal Schoonover knew that he was going to have to do something, and when we get back from this next break, we'll hear what happened. Here's Sergeant Alcantar.
All right, and I'll be right back with the weather after this short break. We are back with the North Country Journal Hour, and here's Mr. Frank Fisher.
Yes, thanks, Sergeant Alcantar. Well, in our last segment, we were at the point where Corporal Daniel Schoonover was with his squad of engineers, and they were set, along with the infantry company they were supporting, all set to mount a counterattack against Chinese forces that were on one part of Pork Chop Hill. And we said that the losses that they had suffered under enemy bombardment and enemy fire were so severe that Corporal Schoonover realized he was going to have to do something right away if they were going to be able to get anywhere near carrying out their mission. And it was from this point forward that his actions would earn our nation's highest award for valor, the Medal of Honor. The best way to tell you what happened on the Hill is to read the Medal of Honor citation. Here's what it says, quote, Corporal Schoonover distinguished himself by conspicuous gallantry and outstanding courage above and beyond the call of duty in action against the enemy. He was in charge of an engineer demolition squad attached to an infantry company which was committed to dislodge the enemy from a vital hill. Realizing that the heavy fighting and intense enemy fire made it impossible to carry out his mission, he voluntarily employed his unit as a rifle squad and, forging up the steep, barren slope, participated in the assault on hostile positions. When an artillery round exploded on the roof of an enemy bunker, he courageously ran forward and leaped into the position, killing one hostile infantryman and taking another prisoner. Later in the action, when friendly forces were pinned down by vicious fire from another enemy bunker, he dashed through the hail of fire, hurled grenades in the nearest aperture, then ran to the doorway and emptied his pistol, killing the remainder of the enemy. His brave action neutralized the position and enabled friendly troops to continue their advance to the crest of the hill. When the enemy counterattacked, he constantly exposed himself to the heavy bombardment to direct the fire of his men and to call in an effective artillery barrage on hostile forces. Although the company was relieved early the following morning, he voluntarily remained in the area, manning a machine gun for several hours, and subsequently joined another assault on enemy emplacements. When last seen, he was operating an automatic rifle with devastating effect until mortally wounded by artillery fire. Corporal Schoonover's heroic leadership during 2 days of heavy fighting, superb personal bravery, and willing self-sacrifice inspired his comrades and saved many lives, reflecting lasting glory upon himself and upholding the honored traditions of the military service, unquote. Corporal Schoonover is buried in the National Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu. Well, years later, his company commander, Captain Bertel, wrote a book and acknowledged that Schoonover had demonstrated leadership as well as valor. In a book titled Choices, Pursuing and Overtaking the American Dream, Bertel wrote this of Schoonover, quote, "We supported the infantry in the counterattacks, and after all the infantry chain of command had been killed, a young corporal in my command, Dan D. Schoonover, assumed command of the remains of the unit," unquote. Captain Bertel also said that it was good leadership that went a long way into turning Schoonover into such an exceptional soldier. "I believe," he wrote, "good leadership contributed to the conversion of Schoonover from a problem soldier who was transferred to me from another company to a superb young soldier who performed his duties with extraordinary valor and ability, and who was awarded the Medal of Honor for his sacrifice," unquote. Corporal Schoonover's valor is also memorialized right here in Area 1. The Schoonover Bowl Sports Stadium on Camp Casey is named for him. After the Korean War, the 7th Infantry Division was headquartered on Camp Casey in Donggucheon and remained there until 1971. Schoonover Bowl was built in the 1950s and opened in 1958 as a football field with natural grass turf. Just a few years ago, by the way, USAG Red Cloud and Area 1 renovated Schoonover Bowl. They put in all new synthetic grass, new scoreboards, fencing, state-of-the-art lighting, and the 400-meter track was newly rubberized. So now that you've heard our story, I imagine you can see why I think His example is inspiration to young service members and to seasoned leaders, active duty and civilian. We'll be back with a few final thoughts on Corporal Schoonover, but first, here's Sergeant Alcantar with the break.
All right, we're going to get back into the music with Quote for the Summer right after this break. We are back with the North Country Journal Hour, and here's Mr. Frank Fisher.
We're going to just wrap up today's broadcast with a few thoughts that kind of sum things up as we talk about Corporal Daniel Schoonover, who earned the Medal of Honor during the Korean War. And one of the things that I think is worth mentioning again is that although he was only 19, Corporal Schoonover had all the makings of an excellent soldier, and he became that soldier under the right kind of leadership. Also, in one unit that he was in, he was seen as a problem soldier, but when he transferred to a unit where the company commander, the new commander there, what for him was the new commander, had the knack of turning problem soldiers into really good soldiers, Corporal Schoonover responded to that leadership and became the kind of soldier anyone would want to have in their unit. If you're listening to us this morning and you're a young soldier or airman, a Marine, a sailor, Corporal Schoonover's example is a really good reminder that being young, even maybe still in your teens as he was, will not hold you back from being an outstanding soldier or other service member in time, and won't hold you back from becoming a very good leader. His story reminds us, too, that sometimes the person who's not performing well may actually have big potential, and that a wise, dedicated leader, the kind that Corporal Schoonover's company commander, Captain Bertel, was, can make a key difference. And finally, Corporal Schoonover reminds us of one of the things that has often been said about American service members, about the ordinary soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine. It's something we find many examples of throughout American military history, and that's that when their own leaders are killed or otherwise out of action, they go right into action. They show quick thinking and ingenuity. They figure out a course of action, and they stay with the mission. We'll be highlighting another Korean War Medal of Honor recipient in one of our upcoming North Country Journal Hour broadcasts. That'll be the broadcast of November 5th, and that's when we'll tell the story of Corporal Mitchell Red Cloud, Jr. It's a story that is particularly close to my own heart. In any case, Camp Red Cloud in Uijeongbu, right here in Area 1, is named in his honor, and we'll tell his story, which is a very moving one. The North Country Journal Hour airs every other Thursday at 9 a.m. Our next broadcast is 2 weeks from now, Thursday, October 22nd, here on AFN-KC. I'm Frank Fisher of the Area 1 Public Affairs Office, and I'm editor of the North Country Journal Hour. Handing back now to my North Country Journal Hour broadcast partner, AFN-KC DJ, Army Sergeant Anthony Alcantar. Thanks for joining us. Here's Sergeant Alcantar.
I'm Army Sergeant Anthony Alcantar, and you've been listening to the North Country Journal Hour with me and Mr. Frank Fisher, creator of the North Country Journal radio commentaries and editor of the North Country Journal Hour. As Mr. Fisher said, thank you for joining us.